Okay, so this is problem 29.3, and this is actually, pretty not too difficult a problem. Main thing you just have to know is working capital is normally defined as current assets minus current liabilities. So working capital equals current assets minus current liabilities. The term current means typically is defined as either assets that will be converted into cash within 1 year, typically, and liabilities are amounts owed within a year. So sometimes these are called short-term liabilities and instead of current. But anyway, that's the idea. And working capital is just the difference between the two. Sometimes people don't include cash in the working capital calculation because they want to look more just at the sort of operating nature of the business. But the way he's phrased this problem, I think or the textbook's assuming we include cash in working capital, which is the more textbook definition of working capital. Being right, if we pay out $10 million cash dividend, that means cash is going to drop by $10 million. So the textbook wants us to say what happens to cash and what happens to working capital in each of these situations. So $10 million cash dividend, that goes out to the shareholders, so it doesn't impact any current liability. The dividend, just put $10 million in the mail to shareholders, so you're not paying down any debt. But you are reducing your cash by $10 million and the working capital, therefore, by $10 million, since current assets drop by $10 million and nothing changes over here. If you receive $2,500 from a customer who pays a bill resulting from a previous sale, if they pay a bill, you think accounts receivable. That's what customers owe you. And so actually this doesn't have any impact. It just moves $2,500 it doesn't have any impact on working capital. It would increase cash by $2,500, but have no impact on working capital because that accounts receivable drops by $2,500, cash, assuming we are including cash, and the working capital calculation goes up by the same amount, so no net effect. Now, as an aside, this is an example of how an accountant may think that's transaction's not a very big deal. Working capital didn't really change, so what's the big deal about it? But again, if you're running a small business, cash is everything. And so if you have there's a very big difference between having a large balance in accounts receivable versus and having very little cash, and the opposite, having a lot of cash and not much accounts receivable. Cash is the oxygen a business has to have in order to keep living. Okay, so pay $50,000 previously owed to one of the suppliers. So a supplier, when you owe money to a supplier, that's normally called accounts payable. It's what you owe to a supplier, normally for inventory, things like that. So if we pay $50,000, cash goes down by $50,000 because this is assuming we're paying cash, but accounts payable also goes down by $50,000. So again, cash is reduced, but net working capital doesn't change because there's a equal change on both sides. You borrow $10 million long term. Now that's the key here, long term, and invest the proceeds in inventory. So this is just on the liability side of the working capital calculation. You're only including short-term debt that's due within a year. Or sometimes you'll see current maturities of long-term debt, and that means the portion of long-term debt that is due within a year. If you borrow long-term, that's down here below the line, so forth. As people would say, below the current liability line. So yeah, if you borrow 10 million, long-term liabilities are going to go up by 10 million, but current liabilities aren't, so no change here. But inventory is going to go up by 10 million. So current assets go up 10 million, no change in current liabilities. So working capital has increased by $10 million. Now that's, where you got to be careful. If you just are solely focused on working capital, you'd say, wow, let's just borrow as much long-term as we possibly can and invest it in inventory, and we're doing great because we've increased our working capital. Well, we're not really doing great. We haven't really done anything except potentially hurt ourselves if we can't sell that inventory, because we will have to pay back the debt. So if we invest 10 million in inventory, it turns out we can't sell that inventory or can't sell it for as much as we hoped, we're in a worse position. But anyway, this transaction, borrowing 10 million long-term and investing proceeds in inventory, has no impact on cash, increases inventory by 10 million. Borrow 10 million short-term and invest proceeds in inventory. Well, okay, so in that case, it does. And this goes up by 10 million, and inventory goes up by 10 million. Cash is not impacted, so it's similar to D, except because it's short-term debt, not long-term debt, it does impact working capital, or it impacts this side of the working capital calculation. So in that case, no impact on cash, and net working capital doesn't change because it's gone up by 10 million on each side. The short term being the key term there. Sell 5 million of marketable securities for cash. I didn't write it here, but marketable securities, that would be stocks, bonds, things like that. Typically are considered current assets. Well, there's some situations where if those securities are reserved for some purpose, they may not be a current asset. They may be considered a long-term asset, but we'll assume the more typical scenario where marketable securities are a current asset. And again, this would have increased cash, of course, by 5 million, but have no impact on working capital, because this would go down by 5 million, this would go up by 5 million. So that's my thoughts on that.